The weight of a name can be both a blessing and a curse. Imagine growing up in the shadow of one of the most influential musicians in history, carrying a legacy you never asked for, while simultaneously being cast aside by the very person who gave you life. This is the story of Julian Lennon, a man who spent decades wrestling with feelings of abandonment, rejection, and anger. And now, at 62 years old, he's finally ready to speak the truth about the woman he says changed everything, the woman he admits he truly hated. But who is she? The answer might surprise you, because this isn't just a story about fame and fortune. It's about family, betrayal, and the painful journey toward forgiveness. So stay with me, because what Julian reveals will change everything you thought you knew about one of music's most iconic families. Before we dive into Julian's shocking confession, we need to understand where it all began. Picture this: Liverpool, England, 1963. The Beatles are on the verge of becoming the biggest band on the planet. John Lennon, the sharp-witted, rebellious heart of the group, is married to his art school sweetheart, Cynthia Powell. Their relationship began in the late 1950s at the Liverpool College of Art, where Cynthia was a shy, middle-class girl with blonde hair and proper manners, and John was a leather-jacketed rebel who couldn't seem to stay out of trouble. They were an unlikely pair, but John was smitten. He pursued her relentlessly, and despite her initial reservations about his wild lifestyle, Cynthia fell deeply in love with him. Their courtship was passionate, but complicated. John's personality was intense. He could be charming and romantic one moment, then moody and withdrawn the next. But Cynthia saw something in him that others didn't. She saw his vulnerability, his pain from losing his mother Julia in a tragic accident, and his desperate need to be loved. When Cynthia discovered she was pregnant in 1962, it sent shockwaves through their lives. John was on the cusp of something enormous with the Beatles, and Brian Epstein, their manager, was terrified that news of John being married with a baby would destroy their appeal to teenage girls. So they kept it secret. John and Cynthia married quietly on August 23, 1962, at the Mount Pleasant Register office in Liverpool. It was a rushed, unglamorous affair. No family celebration, no white dress, no honeymoon. Just a quick ceremony squeeze between rehearsals and recording sessions. On April 8, 1963, Julian was born at Sefton General Hospital in Liverpool. John wasn't even there for the birth. He was on tour, living the life of a Beatle, while Cynthia labored alone. When John finally met his son, he seemed bewildered by fatherhood, unsure of how to hold this tiny human being. But there were tender moments in those early days. John would come home between tours and sit with Julian, making funny faces to make him laugh, strumming his guitar while the baby watched with wide eyes. Cynthia has said that John genuinely loved Julian in those early years, but he simply didn't know how to balance being a father with being a Beatle. And increasingly, the latter demanded all of his attention. For a brief moment, John Lennon was a father, a husband, and a Beatle. But as Beatlemania exploded across the globe, the life of young Julian Lennon became anything but normal. The Beatles weren't just famous. They were a cultural phenomenon. They couldn't walk down the street without being mobbed. They couldn't eat in a restaurant without causing a riot. And they certainly couldn't lead normal family lives. John was pulled in 1,000 directions, recording sessions that lasted days, tours that spanned continents, press conferences, photo shoots, and a constant, relentless pressure to write the next hit song. While the world was falling in love with his father, Julian was losing him. The tours, the screaming fans, the studio sessions, John was everywhere except home. Cynthia did her best to shield Julian from the chaos. But how do you explain to a child that his father belongs to the world before he belongs to him? Julian's early years were marked by absence. There are photographs from that era showing Julian as a beautiful child with his mother's soft features and his father's intense eyes. In these photos, he's often alone with Cynthia or surrounded by toys in their home, but rarely with John. John was a distant figure, more myth than man. When John was home, the moments were fleeting and the connection was fragile. Julian would later describe feeling like an outsider in his own father's life, a guest rather than a son. He remembered waiting by the window for his father to come home, only to be disappointed when John would arrive exhausted and irritable, needing space and quiet instead of playtime with an energetic little boy. There was always this sense that Julian was an interruption, an obligation rather than a joy. The Lennon household during these years was complex. Cynthia tried desperately to maintain some semblance of normalcy, creating a warm, stable home for Julian despite John's absences. She read him bedtime stories, took him to the park, taught him his ABCs, and showered him with all the love and attention she had. But she couldn't fill the void left by his father. Julian knew, even as a small child, that something was missing. He'd see other children with their fathers at the playground and wonder why his dad was never there. He'd hear John Lennon's voice on the radio and feel confused. That was his father, yet he hardly knew him. The cognitive dissonance was profound for such a young mind. His father was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And then, in 1968, when Julian was just 5 years old, everything shattered. John Lennon met Yoko Ono. The story of how they met has been told countless times. At the Indica Gallery in London in November 1966, where Yoko was preparing an art exhibition, John was intrigued by her avant-garde work, particularly a piece called Ceiling Painting, where visitors climbed a ladder to view the word yes through a magnifying glass. John later said he appreciated that it was positive, that it said yes instead of no. Now, you might be thinking that Julian's resentment would be directed at Yoko Ono, the woman who many blame for breaking up the Beatles and, in a sense, breaking up the Lennon family. And yes, for many years, Julian's relationship with Yoko was strained, fraught with legal battles over his father's estate and complicated by the fact that she represented everything he had lost. Yoko was the woman who took his father away, the woman who became the center of John's universe, the woman who got to spend John's final years with him while Julian watched from an ocean away. It would be easy to hate her. It would be simple to make her the villain of this story. And for many years, people did. Yoko Ono was vilified by Beatles fans, blamed for the band's breakup, and cast as the wicked stepmother who stole John away from his first family. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because when Julian finally opened up about the person he truly hated, he wasn't just talking about Yoko. He was talking about the complicated feelings he harbored toward his father, John Lennon himself. Julian has admitted that for years, he struggled with deep-seated anger toward a man the world idolized. How could he not? John Lennon preached peace and love to millions, saying imagine, and asked the world to envision a place with no possessions, no greed, no hunger, yet he couldn't find time for his own son. He wrote songs about imagining a better world, yet he couldn't imagine a place for Julian in his new life with Yoko and their son, Sean. The hypocrisy of it all was staggering to Julian. The whole world saw John Lennon as this prophet of peace, this voice of a generation, this man who embodied love and understanding. But Julian saw something different. He saw a man who abandoned his responsibilities, who chose his new family over his old one, who preached love but couldn't show it to his own flesh and blood. The contrast was staggering and became even more painful as the years went on. After Sean was born on October 9, 1975, John's 35th birthday, John famously became a house husband, dedicated himself to raising his second son. He took a 5-year hiatus from music, calling it his house husband years, or his lost weekend come full circle. He baked bread, changed diapers, took Sean to park, and documented every moment of Sean's childhood with photographs and diary entries. He was present. He was engaged. He was attentive. He was everything Julian had always wanted him to be. And Julian saw this. He watched from across the ocean as his father became the man he should have been all along, but for someone else, for the other son, for the chosen one. Can you imagine the pain of that? To see your father give another child the love and attention you so desperately craved? To watch him become the perfect, doting dad you always dreamed he'd be, just not for you? It's a special kind of torture, and Julian lived with it every single day. He'd see pictures in magazines of John and Sean at the park, John and Sean baking together, John and Sean laughing and playing. He'd read interviews where John talked glowingly about fatherhood, about how transformative it was, about how Sean had changed his life and given him purpose. And Julian would think, where was that father when I needed him? Why wasn't I enough to make him stay? Why wasn't I enough to make him care? These are questions that haunted Julian throughout his childhood and well into his adult life. Julian later said in interviews that he felt abandoned, cast aside like yesterday's news, like a rough draft that John had crumpled up and thrown away before writing the final version with Sean. And while John sent occasional birthday cards and made sporadic phone calls, it was never enough. It was never what Julian needed. The wound ran too deep, the absence too profound, and the sense of rejection too complete. But Julian's story isn't just about what he lost. It's also about what he found. In the midst of his pain, there was one person who stepped in, one person who showed him compassion when his own father couldn't. Paul McCartney. Yes, that Paul McCartney, John's songwriting partner, his bandmate, his friend, and sometimes his rival. When John and Cynthia's marriage fell apart, Paul didn't turn his back on them the way many others did. He didn't choose sides or distance himself from the messy situation. Instead, he reached out. Paul would drive out to Cynthia's house in Weybridge, Surrey, to check on her and Julian. He'd spend time with them, talk to Cynthia about what she was going through, and play with Julian, giving the boys some attention and normalcy during a chaotic time. And during one of those visits, during one of those long drives from London to Surrey, Paul started humming a melody in the car. He was thinking about Julian, this little boy whose world was falling apart, and he wanted to do something, anything, to make it better. The original lyrics that came to him were simple but profound. Hey, Jules, don't make it bad. Take a sad song and make it better. Jules, of course, was Julian, his nickname, his identity before the world would know him as John Lennon's forgotten son. Paul later changed Jules to Jude, because it sounded better, it sang better, it had a more universal quality to it. And the song became one of the Beatles' most iconic hits. Hey Jude. 7 minutes and 11 seconds of pure emotion. A song that topped charts around the world. A song that millions of people have sung along to without knowing its origin. It was a song written for Julian. A song meant to comfort a heartbroken little boy who was losing his father and his family and everything he thought was stable in his life. The recording of Hey Jude was itself historic. It was one of the first songs recorded for the Beatles' own Apple Records label. They recorded it at Trident Studios in London over several sessions, and the final recording featured a 50-piece orchestra and a chorus that repeated, na 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 na, na 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 Hey Jude, for over 4 minutes. It was bold, it was different, and it was spectacular. When it was released as a single in August 1968, it became the Beatles' longest single and one of their most successful, staying at #1 for 9 weeks in the United States. It was everywhere, on the radio, on television, in stores, at parties. Everyone knew Hey Jude. Everyone sang Hey Jude. And at the center of its creation was a little boy named Julian, who had no idea that one of the greatest songs ever written was about him. And while the world sang along to it, Julian carried a complicated relationship with those 7 minutes and 11 seconds of music. Julian has described his feelings about Hey Jude as a love-hate relationship, and it's not hard to understand why. On one hand, it's a beautiful gesture from Paul, a reminder that someone cared, that someone saw his pain and wanted to do something about it. It's proof that he mattered to someone, even if that someone wasn't his father. Paul's kindness during that dark time meant everything to Julian, and he's never forgotten it. He said in numerous interviews that Paul was more present, more caring, and more fatherly to him during the divorce than John ever was. Paul showed up. Paul paid attention. Paul tried to make things better. And that meant the world to a 5-year-old boy who felt invisible. On the other hand, Hey Jude is a constant reminder of the worst time in his life. Every time Julian hears it, and trust me, he's heard it thousands upon thousands upon thousands of times, he's taken back to that 5-year-old boy watching his world fall apart. He's taken back to the confusion, the sadness, the sense of loss that permeated every moment of that period. Friends send him videos of babies singing it. Strangers request it at events and parties. People tag him in social media posts about it, and he can never, ever escape it. It's like a scar that never fully heals because people keep pointing at it, touching it, asking him about it. Every Beatles documentary mentions it. Every article about Paul's greatest compositions includes it. And Julian is forever linked to it, forever defined by it in some ways. It's both a gift and a curse, a reminder of Paul's kindness and a reminder of his father's absence. It's beautiful and painful all at once. It's a love letter from someone who wasn't even his father, and a stark reminder that his actual father wasn't there to write one himself. Yet, Julian is grateful to Paul. He said that Paul was more of a father figure to him during that time than John ever was. Paul showed him kindness, consistency, and love when he needed it most. And that means everything. Julian and Paul have maintained a good relationship over the years, with Julian often speaking warmly about Paul in interviews and Paul reciprocating that affection. There's a mutual respect and genuine fondness between them that stands in stark contrast to the complicated relationship Julian had with his own father. In some alternate universe, Paul McCartney might have been the father Julian deserved. Instead, he became the father figure who showed Julian that someone in his father's orbit actually cared about him. As Julian grew older, the distance between him and his father only widened. John moved to New York with Yoko after their marriage, and Julian remained in England with Cynthia. The Atlantic Ocean between them became a metaphor for the emotional distance that had always existed. There were occasional visits, awkward phone calls where neither knew quite what to say, and the ever-present tension of a relationship that never quite clicked, never quite felt natural or easy. Julian tried to build his own life, his own identity, separate from his father's enormous shadow. He went to school, made friends, developed his own interests in music and art. But it was impossible to escape who his father was. Teachers treated him differently. Other kids either idolized him or resented him. The press was constantly interested in him, following him, asking him questions about a man he barely knew. In the mid-1970s, there was a brief window when things seemed like they might improve. Julian reconnected with John, thanks largely to John's girlfriend at the time, May Pang. This period in John's life, from late 1973 to early 1975, is often called his lost weekend, though it lasted much longer than a weekend. John and Yoko had separated, and John was living in Los Angeles and New York with May Pang, a young woman who had worked as Yoko's assistant. May has said that Yoko actually encouraged the relationship, suggesting that John needed time away. Whatever the true circumstances, May proved to be a positive influence on John in many ways. She encouraged him to reconnect with Julian, to reach out, to be a father, and for a short while, John did. Julian visited his father in Los Angeles and New York during this period, and they had something resembling a father-son relationship for the first time in years. They went to Disneyland together, an iconic image that was captured in photographs showing John looking more relaxed and present than he had in years. They spent time in recording studios, with John showing Julian the magic of music production. They had meals together, walked through Central Park, talked about life and art and the future. Julian has spoken fondly of these times, describing them as the closest he ever felt to his father. For a brief moment, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, they could build a real relationship. Maybe John could be the father Julian needed. Maybe it wasn't too late. But it didn't last. It couldn't last, perhaps, because John wasn't ready or willing to maintain that connection once circumstances changed. When John reunited with Yoko in early 1975, Julian was once again pushed to the periphery. The visits stopped. The phone calls became less frequent. The attention evaporated. It was as if John had a limited capacity for relationships, and when Yoko was in his life, there was simply no room for anyone else, including his first son. Julian went from feeling like he finally had a father to feeling abandoned all over again. And this time, it hurt even more because he'd had a taste of what it could be like, what it should be like. He'd experienced real connection with his father, only to have it snatched away. In some ways, this made the loss even more painful than if he'd never reconnected at all. At least before, he could imagine what having a relationship with John might be like. Now, he knew exactly what he was missing, exactly what John was capable of giving, but chose not to give him. And then, on December 8th, 1980, everything changed forever. John Lennon was shot and killed outside the Dakota apartment building in New York City by Mark David Chapman, a deranged fan who had asked for John's autograph just hours earlier. Julian was 17 years old, on the cusp of adulthood, still trying to figure out who he was and what his relationship with his father meant. When he got the news, his world shattered in a completely different way than it had when his parents divorced. Then, there had been the possibility, however slim, that things might change, that John might one day wake up and realize what he'd been missing. But now John was gone, dead at 40 years old. murdered on a New York City street. And with him went any hope of reconciliation, any possibility of having the conversations Julian so desperately needed to have, any chance of receiving the apology he deserved. Julian never got the chance to sit down with his father as an adult and ask him the questions that haunted him. Why wasn't I enough? Why did you leave? Why couldn't you love me the way you loved Sean? Why did you preach peace and love to the world but couldn't show it to your own son? These questions will remain forever unanswered, hanging in the air like ghosts. Julian never got to hear his father say, "I'm sorry. I was wrong. I should have been there for you." He never got to experience his father's pride in his accomplishments, his support during difficult times, his guidance as he navigated adulthood. John was gone, and with him, any hope of closure. All Julian had left were memories, some good, mostly painful, and a legacy that was both a gift and a burden. The aftermath of John's death was another chapter of pain for Julian. He wasn't even allowed to attend his father's memorial service in New York. Cynthia made the decision that Julian shouldn't go, believing it would be too traumatic for him, and that the media circus surrounding John's death would be overwhelming for a teenage boy. She worried about his safety, his emotional well-being, and whether he could handle the intensity of the public mourning. So Julian grieved from afar, sitting in England while the world mourned in New York, surrounded by a world that mourned John Lennon, the legend, the icon, the voice of a generation, while Julian mourned the father he never truly had, the relationship that never materialized, the love he never received. The world lost a musical genius. Julian lost a father he barely knew. These are not the same thing, but no one seemed to understand that. Everyone expected Julian to be devastated in the same way the world was devastated. But his grief was different. It was complicated, layered with anger and regret and unresolved pain. He was mourning not just the death of his father, but the death of any possibility that their relationship might be repaired. And then came the state battle, which would drag on for 16 agonizing years and become one of the most painful chapters of Julian's life. When John Lennon's was read, the terms were devastating to Julian. John's left almost everything to Yoko and Sean. Julian was left with a trust fund of about £100,000 to be shared with Sean. Let that sink in for a moment. John Lennon's estate was estimated to be worth hundreds of millions of pounds, and his first son was left with a shared trust fund of £100,000. It was an insult, a final slap in the face, a confirmation that Julian had never mattered to his father in any meaningful way. It felt like a final insult, a last confirmation that Julian didn't matter, that he was an afterthought, a footnote in his father's story. The provisions of the will made it clear that John saw Sean as his legitimate heir and Julian as an obligation he'd rather forget. Under New York State intestacy law, if John had died without a will, Julian would have been entitled to approximately 25% of his father's estate, potentially worth around $200 million at the time. Instead, he got £100,000 to share with his half-brother. The message was clear. You don't belong to this family. You're not part of this legacy. You're not my son in any way that matters. For Julian, reading that will must have been like being abandoned all over again, like experiencing his father's rejection from beyond the grave. It confirmed every fear, every insecurity, every painful belief he'd held about his place in his father's life, or rather, his lack of a place. So Julian did what he had to do. He sued. In 1982, Julian filed a lawsuit against his father's estate, challenging the will and arguing that he had been unfairly cut out his father's legacy. It was a decision that took courage because he knew what the public reaction would be. He knew he'd be portrayed as greedy, as opportunistic, as the bitter son trying to cash in on his father's death. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. The press had a field day with it. Headlines screamed about the ungrateful son suing his father's widow. Some Beatles fans turned against him, accusing him of trying to steal from Yoko and Sean. But Julian pressed forward because it wasn't really about the money. It was about recognition, about being acknowledged as John Lennon's son, about fighting for his place in a legacy that he had been excluded from his entire life. For 16 years, Julian and Yoko battled in court over John's estate. It was messy, public, expensive, and painful. Lawyers argued back and forth. Documents were filed and refiled. Negotiations stalled and restarted. The whole thing dragged on through Julian's 20s and into his 30s, defining that period of his life and forcing him to relive his father's rejection over and over again. But finally, in 1996, they reached a settlement. The exact terms were kept confidential, but Julian reportedly received around £20 million, a fraction of what he would have been entitled to under intestacy laws, but significantly more than the pittance John had left him. With that money, Julian did something poignant, something that speaks volumes about his emotional state and his need for connection with a father he never really knew. He started collecting his father's memorabilia, the notes John had written, the guitars he had played, the iconic round glasses he had worn, the jackets he had performed in. Julian bought them back, one piece at a time. He was reclaiming pieces of a father he never really knew, trying to connect with a man through objects because he couldn't do it in life. He attended auctions, bid on items, and slowly built a collection of his father's belongings. In one particularly poignant purchase, Julian spent £30,000 to buy back the notes for Hey Jude, the song Paul had written for him. He said he couldn't bear the thought of those notes belonging to anyone else, of that tangible piece of connection being owned by a stranger. Each object he acquired was like a breadcrumb on a path leading back to a relationship that never existed, an attempt to build connection with a ghost, to understand a father he never got to know. Julian's relationship with Yoko Ono has always been complicated, layered with years of pain, resentment, legal battles, and the complex dynamics of a blended family that never quite blended. For years, she was the easy target for his anger. She was a woman who came between his parents, the woman who seemed to control John's every move, the woman who dominated his attention and affection, the woman who inherited everything. It was easy to blame Yoko, to make her the villain, to direct all his rage and hurt at her. And let's be honest, Yoko didn't always make it easy for Julian. The legal battles were brutal. The way John's estate was handled seemed designed to minimize Julian's role in the family. There were stories of Yoko being cold to Julian, of her seeing him as a threat to Sean's inheritance, of her wanting to erase John's first family from history. But as Julian has matured, as he's done the emotional work of therapy and self-reflection, his perspective has shifted in significant ways. He's admitted that while Yoko may have been part of the problem, she wasn't the root of it. She wasn't the person who made the decisions that hurt him most. The root was John. John made the choices. John walked away. John neglected his first son in favor of his second. John left that will. John failed to show up, to be present, to be a father. Yoko was a convenient scapegoat, an easy person to blame, a visible target for anger that really belonged elsewhere. But the real betrayal came from his father. This realization, that the person you're supposed to love unconditionally is also the person who hurt you the most, is what Julian has been grappling with for decades. It's easier to hate a stepmother who represents what you lost than to hate the father who chose to leave. And it's this complicated truth that makes his recent confession so powerful. When Julian says, "I truly hated her," he's not just talking about Yoko, though she's certainly part of the equation. He's talking about the anger he felt toward the circumstances, the neglect, the erasure of his existence in his father's new life, the years of feeling invisible and unwanted. But more than that, he's talking about his father. He hated what John did to him. He hated the absence, the broken promises, the feeling of being unwanted, the watching from afar as John became the perfect father to someone else. He hated that John could write songs about peace and love while showing neither to his own son. He hated the hypocrisy, the abandonment, the rejection, and that hatred ate at him for years, coloring everything he did, every relationship he had, every decision he made. It was like carrying around a boulder, heavy and immovable, weighing him down every single day. But here's the thing about Julian Lennon that makes his story so compelling. He's also incredibly resilient and introspective. He didn't let that hatred define him forever. He didn't let it turn him bitter and twisted. Instead, he channeled it into his art, his music, his photography, his writing, and his humanitarian work. He took his pain and transformed it into something beautiful, something meaningful, something that could help others. Julian launched his own music career in 1984 with the album Velat, when he was just 21 years old. The album was a commercial success, reaching number 17 on the Billboard 200 and producing several hit singles, including Too Late for Goodbyes, and the title track Velat. Critics praised his songwriting and his voice, which bore an uncanny resemblance to his father's, though Julian worked hard to develop his own style and sound. He proved he had talent independent of his last name, though the comparisons to John were inevitable and often suffocating. Every review mentioned his father. Every interview started with questions about John. Every performance was analyzed through the lens of his lineage. It must have been exhausting to constantly be measured against a legend, to have your own accomplishments overshadowed by someone else's legacy. Julian released several more albums throughout the 1980s and 1990s, including The Secret Value of Daydreaming, Mr. Jordan, and Help Yourself. Some were more successful than others, but all demonstrated his artistic vision and his determination to forge his own path. But the pressure of living up to the Lennon name, combined with the unresolved pain of his relationship with his father, eventually led Julian to step away from the spotlight. He took long breaks from music, sometimes for years at a time, finding peace in other pursuits like photography and philanthropy. He traveled the world, capturing stunning images of indigenous peoples, landscapes, and wildlife. His photography has been exhibited in galleries around the world and published in several books. Through the lens of the camera, Julian found a way to see beauty in the world, to document life from his perspective, to create art that was entirely his own and had nothing to do with his father's legacy. And perhaps most importantly, Julian founded the White Feather Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to environmental and humanitarian causes. The foundation's name comes from a promise John made to Julian. John told his son that if there was any way to communicate after death, he would send Julian a white feather as a sign. Years after John's death, Julian was on tour in Australia when he walked into a room and saw a white feather floating down from the ceiling. There was no explanation for it. No open windows, no fans, no logical reason. But Julian felt it was a message from his father, and he decided to honor it by creating something positive. The foundation has supported numerous causes, including clean water initiatives, education programs, conservation efforts, and humanitarian relief. Julian has dedicated himself to making the world better, to turning his pain into purpose, to using his platform and resources to help others who are suffering. And through it all, Julian has worked towards something many thought impossible: forgiveness. This is perhaps the most remarkable part of his journey, because forgiveness is never easy, and it's especially difficult when the person who hurt you is no longer alive to apologize or make amends. In recent interviews, Julian has spoken openly about forgiving his father, about coming to terms with John's failures and flaws, about accepting that holding on to anger only hurt himself. He's acknowledged that John was a flawed human being, a product of his own traumatic childhood and his own unresolved pain. John's father abandoned him when he was young. His mother, Julia, was killed in a car accident when John was just 17, a loss that devastated him and that he never fully recovered from. John grew up feeling unloved, unwanted, and angry at the world. He never learned how to be present, how to be vulnerable, how to show love in healthy ways. And he repeated those patterns with his own son. It doesn't excuse the hurt, but it explains it. It provides context. It helps Julian understand that his father's failures weren't really about him. They were about John's own brokenness, his own inability to be what Julian needed. Julian has said that holding on to anger only hurt himself, that it poisons relationships and his ability to find peace and happiness. He said that forgiveness was the only path to peace, that was something he did for himself, not for his father. That doesn't mean the pain is gone. It doesn't mean he's forgotten what happened, or that everything is suddenly okay. But it means he's chosen to move forward rather than remain stuck in the past, to live his life on his own terms rather than being defined by his father's failures. And that's incredibly powerful, incredibly brave, incredibly human. And that's incredibly powerful. Julian's relationship with his half-brother Sean is also worth examining, because it could have easily been another source of bitterness and resentment. Sean, after all, got everything Julian didn't: his father's time, attention, love, and the bulk of his estate. Sean grew up with a father Julian always wanted, experienced a childhood Julian dreamed of, and was recognized as a legitimate heir to John Lennon's legacy. But despite the complicated dynamics, Sean being the favored son, the chosen one, the one who got John's time and attention, Julian and Sean have maintained a close relationship over the years. They bonded over their shared loss, their shared father, and the unique burden of being John Lennon's sons. They've supported each other through the years, attended events together, and spoken warmly about each other in interviews. It's a testament to Julian's character that he didn't let resentment poison that relationship too, that he was able to separate his feelings about his father from his feelings about his brother. Sean didn't ask to be the favored son any more than Julian asked to be the forgotten one. They were both just children caught in the complicated dynamics of their father's life and choices. Julian's story resonates with so many people around the world because it's not just about being the son of Beatle or inheriting a famous name. It's about feeling unseen, unheard, and unloved by a parent, something millions of people experience regardless of fame or fortune. It's about the lifelong impact of abandonment and the struggle to find your own identity when you're constantly compared to someone else, constantly living in someone's shadow, constantly being defined by someone else's choices. It's about the courage it takes to confront your pain honestly, to speak your truth even when it's uncomfortable, and to eventually let go of the hate that's been weighing you down for your entire life. It's about recognizing that your parents are flawed human beings who did the best they could with the tools they had, even if that best was nowhere near good enough. It's about choosing healing over bitterness, growth over stagnation, and peace over perpetual anger. Julian Lennon's confession, "I truly hated her," is not just about a woman, not just about Yoko Ono, and not even just about his father, John Lennon. It's about all the complicated, messy, painful emotions that come with being human, with having a family, with experiencing rejection and disappointment and loss. It's about a little boy who just wanted his dad to love him, to see him, to choose him. And it's about a man who spent his whole life trying to make peace with the fact that his father never could give him what he needed, that some wounds never fully heal, but you learn to live with them anyway. That forgiveness isn't about condoning what happened, but about freeing yourself from the prison of anger and resentment. At 62, Julian Lennon has lived a full, rich, complicated life, one filled with creativity, compassion, resilience, and courage. He's a musician who's released 7 studio albums and numerous singles, creating a body of work that stands on its own merit. He's a photographer whose work has been exhibited internationally and published in beautiful coffee table books that capture the wonder and diversity of our world. He's an author who's written children's books, including Touch the Earth and Heal the Earth, that teach young people about environmental stewardship and compassion. He's an advocate and philanthropist who's dedicated significant time and resources to making the world a better place through the White Feather Foundation and other charitable efforts. He's used his platform to speak out on issues that matter: environmental protection, clean water access, indigenous rights, education, and humanitarian relief. He's made a tangible difference in countless lives, turning his own pain into purpose and his own struggle into a mission to help others. But perhaps his greatest achievement, the thing that matters most, is the emotional honesty he's brought to his story. In a world where celebrity children are often expected to smile for the cameras, say all the right things, protect their parents' legacies, and pretend everything was perfect, Julian has dared to be real. He's shared his hurt, his anger, his confusion, his journey toward healing. He hasn't sugarcoated his experience or pretended his childhood was something it wasn't. He hasn't protected his father's image at the expense of his own truth. And in doing so, he's given voice to countless others who felt the same way. The forgotten children, the abandoned sons and daughters, the people who grew up feeling like they weren't enough, like they didn't matter, like they were replaceable. Julian's willingness to be vulnerable, to show his scars, to admit he struggled with hatred and anger, is what makes his story so compelling and so important. He's not asking for pity, and he's not looking for attention or sympathy. He's simply telling his truth, owning his experience, and showing others that it's possible to survive and even thrive after childhood trauma. And that truth is powerful, liberating, and necessary. The journey to forgiveness is never easy, never linear, never complete. It's not something you do once, and then you're done. It's an ongoing process, a daily choice, a constant recommitment to letting go and moving forward. And it's especially difficult when the person who hurt you is no longer around to apologize or make amends or even acknowledge what they did wrong. Julian has had to do that work on his own, without any closure from John, without any apology or explanation or acknowledgement of the pain he caused. He's had to do it in therapy, sitting in rooms with professionals helping him unpack decades of trauma and abandonment. He's had to do it through his art, channeling his feelings into songs and photographs and stories. And he's had to do it in his own heart, in the quiet moments when he's alone with his thoughts and his memories and his grief. He's had to reconcile the image of the father the world loved, the peace activist, the musical genius, the voice of a generation, with the father he knew or didn't know. He's had to accept that John Lennon was both a genius and deeply flawed, capable of great love and great neglect, able to inspire millions while failing the person closest to him. He's had to accept that both things are true, that people are complex and contradictory, that you can love someone and hate them at the same time, that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or condoning what happened. And he's had to decide whether to carry that burden of anger for the rest of his life, or to set it down and walk away from it. Julian chose to set it down, not because it was easy. It was probably the hardest thing he's ever done. Not because he forgot what happened or suddenly decided it was okay. It wasn't okay, and it never will be. But because it was necessary for his own well-being, for his own mental health, for his own ability to live a full and meaningful life. Because holding on to hatred was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. Because the only person being hurt by his anger was himself. And that choice has allowed him to live a life that's not defined by his father's shadow, not consumed by bitterness, not trapped in the past. It's allowed him to create his own legacy, build his own identity, and define himself on his own terms. It's allowed him to step out of John Lennon's enormous shadow and into his own light. Julian Lennon's story is a reminder that fame and fortune don't insulate you from pain, don't protect you from family dysfunction, don't shield you from feeling abandoned and unloved and invisible. Money can't buy you love, as the Beatles themselves once sang, and it certainly can't buy you a relationship with a parent who doesn't want to be present. They don't make forgiveness any easier or healing any faster. Growing up as a celebrity's child doesn't mean your life is charmed or easy or without struggle. Often, it means the opposite. It means living under impossible expectations, constant scrutiny, relentless comparisons, and the burden of a legacy you never asked for. But they also don't have to define you. You can choose a different path. You can write a different story. You can create a different legacy. Julian has taken his pain and transformed it into something beautiful, a life dedicated to making a difference, to creating art that moves people, to supporting causes that matter, and to finding peace within himself. He's shown that it's possible to honor your feelings without being consumed by them, to acknowledge your past without being trapped by it, to carry your scars without letting them define you. And he's proven that even when you grow up in the shadow of a legend, you can still find your own way, your own voice, and your own purpose. You can still build a life worth living, create work worth sharing, and become a person worth knowing. Julian Lennon's confession is not the end of his story. It's a new chapter, a turning point, a declaration of independence from the pain that's haunted him for so long. It's him finally saying out loud what he's felt for decades, claiming his truth, owning his experience, and refusing to stay silent anymore. It's him finally free to be himself, unburdened by hate, open to hope, and committed to living authentically. When he says, "I truly hated her," he's not spreading malice or trying to hurt anyone. He's stating a fact about his emotional journey, acknowledging the depth of pain he experienced, validating the anger that was a natural response to profound hurt. And by speaking that truth, he's released its power over him. He's taken back control of his narrative, his identity, and his life. As we reflect on Julian's journey, it's impossible not to feel a deep sense of empathy for the boy who just wanted his father's love, who waited by the window for a dad who rarely came home, who watched from across the ocean as his father became the perfect parent to someone else. But it's also impossible not to admire the man he's become, a man of grace, dignity, resilience, and profound emotional intelligence. A man who's not afraid to speak his truth, to show his vulnerability, to admit he struggled and suffered and sometimes hated. A man who chose healing over bitterness, growth over stagnation, purpose over victimhood. Julian has not only survived his painful childhood, he's thrived in spite of it. He's built a life that's meaningful, impactful, and true to who he is. He's created art that matters, supported causes that help people, and become a voice for those who feel forgotten and unseen. And in finally admitting the depth of his feelings, the hate, the hurt, the longing, he's given us all permission to do the same, to acknowledge our pain, to confront our demons, and to choose forgiveness not for people who hurt us, but for ourselves. Because that's what Julian's story is ultimately about. Choosing yourself, choosing healing, choosing to move forward into the light, even when the shadows of the past are long and dark. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful message of all, the legacy that matters most, and the truth that will endure long after the music fades away.